So in our last class, we learned how to do a polling memo. Obviously, in the name is the word poll, and the whole goal of that polling memo is to provide information to a pollster. Today, I'm here with Ken Goldstein, and we're going to talk about how the pollster takes the opposition research polling memo and puts it into a poll so that we can figure out the best way to use that research during the course of the campaign. Ken, can you explain exactly what a polling instrument looks like?
Sure.
And then where research comes into?
Sure. So it's Ken Goldstein playing the role of pollster today, instead of just talking about polls. So we've talked about in the class about a lot of the technical things in getting prepared about who to sample and how you do the interviewing. But then it comes down to what the instrument is. And let me just sort of add one other point of context, which is a number of people that we've talked to in the class will have made the point that even though everyone does pay attention to that horse race number, what real political professionals care about is not so much the horse race number, but the internals and what's the ability to move that horse race number with messages. So it's always better to be ahead than behind. Right. But when you really get bummed is if you're still behind after the polling memo comes back and you've said all these things, after you test all these messages. So typically what would happen is someone like Brett, and I think you guys are going to do this as an assignment, right?
Yes.
They're going to have to come up with a polling memo, would go out and do all their research stuff, do their research thing, and glean that into a succinct memo that says, here are the top, and you tell me, 20 hits against the opponent, and also what are
exactly
things that we're vulnerable on. Right. And then they would give that to the team. And when it's working best, they're not only giving it to the nerd, the pollster, they're also giving it to folks on the creative side as well. But it's definitely the pollster who's going to take the first crack at it. And so what I would do is then I would take Brett's memo that gives me a bunch of factual things. And that's key. Factual points.
Right. Everything is cited. There's nothing that's interpreted. Everything is based on something we can actually prove.
Right. And now, Brett, because he's done this, he's also going to maybe try and identify certain themes for me as well. It's not just going to be the dry bullet points. Right. But his job is less to make it compelling language and more to give me really good information quickly and efficiently. My job then is to take that information and craft a series of questions or statements, which would be akin to the series or statements that would comprise a television ad or a speech or a digital ad or a radio ad. And it's done in a couple different ways, but one basic framework is you write a question that says something along the lines of, I'm going to read you a list of statements that people have said about
Congressman X.
Congressman Snodgrass,
right.
or whoever it is. If true, please tell me whether you find that to be a very convincing, somewhat convincing, not too convincing, or not at all convincing reason to vote against if they're not nice things, or vote for if they're, because you would also test positive message to vote for or against a particular candidate.
Now, do you use that setup only? Because I've seen pollsters use serious doubts, somewhat serious doubts. No. So do we use just convincing, or is that something you are wedded to, or do you think the wording changes?
So I'm not a fan of the serious doubts because I'm not exactly sure what that means. Okay. But there's different ways of doing it. There's the convincing battery. What I also am more or using more now, and again, I don't do candidates and campaigns. I do some work. I do some work actually for universities. I'm a big fan of the believability battery.
Okay.
So it's often the case that Brett's going to go find something that's true. That's absolutely true.
Yep.
There's a complete paper trail, but people don't believe it.
Right.
No matter what.
Right.
And so I will often find that very, very good as well. But that's a good point, because what you can do is, so let's say we take the convincing battery.
Right.
There's a number of different things you can do. One is just to order it by which of those messages people found the most convincing.
Right.
And I'm one of those people who I only like to use the very convincing
Yes.
when I order it because I think there's sort of a mushy middle. So I like to use the very convincing. So I'll order it by very convincing. Then I'll just ask people, I'll say at the end, I've said 10 things, which is the one that stands out to you the most. And it's a happy world where the one that comes out is the very convincing is also the one
they may remember the
that
most.
they remember. And then what I'll also do, and it was really some folks on the Democratic side who pioneered this, but I think everyone's doing it now. I'll then do a simple regression where I'll take the individual level data and I'll put someone's gender and their education and their party ID, but then I'll put how convincing they said each of these messages were and see which one of those has the biggest influence on the vote.
Okay.
Now, another thing I should have said, what we'll also typically do in those sorts of things is, I shouldn't say we because I don't do candidates, but if I was doing candidates, you'd ask the horse race question.
Right.
Then you'd ask the battery. Then you'd ask the horse race question again. And I'm looking to see whether I got any movement and who I got the movement with. And that's a really crucial part. You're not going to move everybody, and your research memo doesn't think you're going to move everybody.
Right. And so the other aspect of it is you're testing your opponent's negatives, but you're also testing your own. Do you rotate those? Do you keep them in the same order? And why do you rotate?
It's funny. I had there was someone I used to work with who someone must have told him at some workshop that you had to rotate. And so I would do these big surveys that had all sorts of things that could go wrong, but he would always raise his hand because someone had asked him, did you rotate? So I would always go, yes, we rotated. So why do you rotate?
Right.
Because what comes first or what comes last could have an influence. So I double rotate. So what does that mean? I both rotate within the battery. So let's say we have 10 messages against the opponent. I would rotate those 10 messages, but then I would rotate the 10 messages against our candidate, but then I would also rotate whether people get the anti-message on our guy before they get the anti-message on the other person as well.
And so that way, everything we're testing is generally, it's all washed out in the end.
Your hope is that if there's an influence on question order, on average, that's going to wash out because an equal number of people are seeing it before or after.
So we have you've tested, what do you consider the right sample size for doing something like this? If you're going to test a real negative in a congressional race, I've seen people use, or not people, but I've seen polls that have about 250, I've seen 400, I've seen 600. What would you say is the minimum that you would want to have for something like this?
So listen, at the end of the day, the question is how much money the campaign has. And with all the caveats of as long as they're well-chosen people, but you really do want a large sample size as possible to make any decisions on a benchmark poll that includes message testing that's less than 800 people, I think is crazy. That said, I bet most of those decisions are based on surveys that are of less than 800 people.
I would guarantee they almost, unless you're doing a statewide, I think you're almost getting more than everybody's doing at least 800. But I'd say a congressional race, 500 is probably the max.
So just imagine, so Brett's doing a congressional race with 500, okay, and let's say it's an evenly split congressional seat. So immediately, let's say it's a third, right? So you got 160 Dems, 160 Republicans, 160 swing voters, and then half those swing voters aren't really swing voters, they're really closeted Dems or closeted Republicans. You're really looking at how messages are moving 40 or 50 people, and that can be pretty noisy.
And what's the plus or minus on something like that?
I mean, you get probably 12,
right?
If you're calculating it statistically, but just at your gut level also. Now, what's interesting is it used to be a world, and you're not quite as old as me, but you're still a little bit older. I mean, you remember when you used to do message testing and ad testing in person, right? You'd go to the Holiday Inn in Toledo, Ohio, and do it with
You'd roll it out, you'd have
people.
12 people in a room, and they'd all look at the negative ads and say, yes, I like this, no, I don't like that. And it's crazy that you would test 800 people and then you bring your ads to 12 and make your decisions based on what 12
and then
people
spend $10 million, although back then you weren't spending $10 million.
As the class knows, I worked for Chuck Schumer, and that was 1998, and that was a $40 million race.
But in the state of New York.
Right, yes, fair enough. But it's still, I mean.
In the
really,
state of New York against a
yeah.
well-financed incumbent.
Right.
But I think that what candidates and campaigns can do now is really, triangulate's one of those buzzwords, or multi-platform is one of those buzzwords that, you might make these initial decisions off of a survey of 800 or maybe 1,000 people. It used to be a big deal to create ads. Right. It used to be a big deal to create content. It's much easier to create rough content now.
Right.
And I think the smart campaigns are creating rough content off of that initial test and then web testing it and testing it in the wild.
The only caveat I would have is the thing that makes them nervous is research you kind of hoard like gold. Campaigns are very nervous to even do the 800 calls because most likely they're calling someone who's going to inform the other campaign, hey, here's what they said. If you're doing rough cut web content and you're sending it out to 400, 500 people to get, all somebody has to do is they do a screen grab. Yeah. And then you have actually the whole entire negative, not just what somebody transcribed on the phone. But I agree with you, that's probably the way where we're going now. And it's just much easier. And instead of getting 12 people in a room, you're getting several hundred people to watch a 30-second ad. And I don't know, can they do dial testing during that now?
Yeah, there's essentially dial testing during those ads, yeah. You can see this, and people love the squiggly lines.
Of course.
Yeah. I always, I didn't feel too bad for them because the media guys are always the ones who make all the money, but to be sitting in the back room.
Oh my God.
And this is.
Hate it.
This
is right? The worst. Yeah.
Yeah, like this is their great artistic work, and the line goes down like that. One other crucial thing for folks to remember is, and they're probably not going to be so much doing the research, but hiring folks like you, use the heck out of Brett or your researcher. Yes. So Brett shouldn't do the research, hand me the memo. He needs to look at my poll.
Absolutely.
Because I might write a great question and I didn't like his language, so I tweaked it a little bit, but it turns out that he wasn't just being inartistic, he was being accurate.
Right.
And because there's lots of places this can fall down. I mean, I've seen it happen where you get the polling memo, and then at some point either the pollster changes the language, or even more so, the ad-making wizard changes the language, and Brett never sees it until
we already have the data back.
Until you already have until it's gone to the television station, right. And the other side has now hit you with that's inaccurate. Right.
So that's the worst.
Really bad.
Right. That's the worst thing that can happen, which is why we try to make sure that after we hand over the polling memo, we actually check the instrument itself for its accuracy. And there's a lot of uncomfortable fights where you say, no, we really can't say that. This is what we can prove. But as you pointed out, you have to make sure it's accurate, because if you're going to spend $10 million on something, you better make sure it can stay on television.